as workers, we need to understand what is the purpose of speaking to children. Why do we think it's important? Because I think if you understand why you're doing it, then the desire to do it well increases. So for me, it's really important to think about why we include children and why we speak to children and why we want their views, for two reasons. Firstly, children have a right to participate in decisions, and and all that involves. But also, if we think about child development and we think about the characteristics of children who are more resilient, what we know is having the opportunity to have some control over what happens to you, actually it helps those children to develop those sort of key characteristics. So I think it's really important to understand that speaking to children is actually something that's really helpful for them as well as for you as the worker as well, especially if your purpose is to want to know what the child thinks about something or to get the child's view on something. So I think, as we would with any communication with anyone, we need to think about who is it that I'm communicating to and how can I best communicate with them so that I understand what it is that they want to tell me, and I help them to be able to tell me that through creating an atmosphere where, you know, those views and those ideas can be exchanged. I say that it's like communicating with anyone because we need to think of some very core basic things, like we need to think about the language that we will be speaking in. We need to think for children, particularly around their age of development, and so their comprehension, their understanding of certain terms that we may use. And we also need to think for children to reflect upon what's their experience of being spoken to by adults, both culturally and socially within their own setting, but also think about their own individual experiences. So if a child hasn't had much experience of being given choices or being asked what they really think, or they come from a cultural or societal environment where children are not given permission to speak, or where they're asked, when they are given permission to speak, they're very much expected to give certain responses, then that will impinge upon what we can, how we need to approach that conversation with the child and how we need to work directly with the child. I think the other thing that we ought to also think about is about layers of understanding as well. So both in terms of what we ask children or how we communicate with children, but also think about how it is that they respond to us and what they say to us. So I'm always particularly struck, for example, with where children may perhaps give one-word answers, or where they may say something which seems out of context with what we're saying, as maybe a cue to being that they haven't really understood what we're asking them or what we're talking to them about. I think the other thing is from an ethical position, we must always explain to children, you know, why we want to speak to them. If that's in the context of something very formal, like, for example, case management, and we're wanting to meet them as part of an assessment, or we're looking at what alternative durable solutions there might exist for them in terms of where they might live in the future. And so we're wanting to be informed by their thoughts and their views on that in terms of the decisions that we make. And I think it's extremely important that we explain to children that this is what we're doing. But in general terms, I think it's also important for children, especially younger children, but not only younger children, to give sufficient time to be able to develop the relationship with the child. So to understand that they're not necessarily used to someone coming in and asking a series of technical questions, and that what we might need to do is spend a lot of time or considerable time discussing with them, developing a relationship with them, and really getting to know the child before we can start to explore in greater depth what it is that perhaps we may want to speak to or to speak about. And connected to that, of course, there are different things that we can do in terms of helping that process of communication. We can think about using different mediums for communicating. So we might choose to use, art or music or drawing or role play as a way of helping children express what they think. But it's also really important to understand that we're not doing therapy. So we're using art or we're using drawing as a way to help a child talk. What we're not doing is interpreting what a child is doing. So, for example, if we were to be looking at a child who maybe we're thinking about fostering or we're thinking about returning with the family, we may ask them if they're a younger child, perhaps we may involve them in drawing a picture of what they imagine their ideal family would be. And then we would start to use that to talk about, well, what does family mean and who is significant in the family and what are the roles within the family and what kind of family do they think would work for them. We wouldn't be getting a child to draw a picture and then say, well, based on that picture, my interpretation is this is the family that the child needs. That's a different kind of work, not the sort of work that we would be doing in a kind of child protection intervention. And I think it's really important that, but even when we think about using different media for children to be able to as a conduit for conversation, really. It's always really important within that to give children the choice of what they want to do. So I might have an idea that drawing a picture and then being able to talk about the picture would be a really nice activity and would be something that would be really helpful. But actually for a child who perhaps doesn't feel particularly artistic or they're don't think they're particularly good at drawing or it isn't something that's particularly interesting for them, that might be quite constraining. And certainly I can think of children who've enjoyed writing or doing poems or creating, a written story. And for other children, that would feel like school and that really wouldn't feel like something that they would want to do. And there are other things that we can do, to be much more creative, even around things like for children who find it difficult to talk or who may be more reticent and where what you may be getting is more of a sort of ping pong, I ask the question, they answer, I ask the question, they answer, and it's not really a conversation. We can think about doing things like having games where, if someone scores a point, they get to ask a question. So if the child scores a point, they get to ask the question of you as the worker. If you score the point, you get to ask the question of them. And the sort of the mutual rules of the game are, if you're asked a question, then you must be honest. And that certainly worked really well, I can think, with children who found it very difficult to engage in conversation, but where we've actually really wanted to get information from them. The problem with that, of course, is that there is an element of boundaries and there is an element of transparency that the worker needs to think about and how they're going to use that in the way that's most helpful for the child. So, if you have a game which is, we will play football or something, and every time I score, I get to ask you a question and you have to answer it honestly, and the that will apply. Those rules apply to the worker as well as the child. Often, what people will say to me is, children only over a certain age can be asked their opinion on things, and I think as soon as you're old enough to say yes or no, you can start to begin to express your preference on something. And the skill is then the job is for the worker to be able to communicate with the child. It's not the child's job to be able to find a way to communicate with the worker. When we're thinking about sort of cultural, the sort of broader issues and things which may impact upon the child and their ability to communicate, I think there are some things which are seen and which are known, and some things which are totally unknown. And what I would say, so some of those things might be, for example, where there are differences or where there are ideas about different genders and what's permissible to say between genders. So I might think about particularly issues around sort of menstruation or personal hygiene for girls in some societies wouldn't necessarily be something that a man would be able to discuss with them. I mean, the male worker might feel quite able to discuss it, but for the child, that may not be a conversation that's permissible. Also, where there are ages as well, where there are age differences, and where children have been brought up in environments where they don't really, they can't really speak freely, or they can't really interact and give their views with an adult because they're always waiting for the approval of the older person. That will be another issue as well. And also some of the other things which I think we don't necessarily know, which may be how the child perceives us. So I don't want to become really sort of deep and psychological about this, but I do think there are children who, we as workers sometimes remind them of different people in their lives, which may or may not enable them to speak more easily or less easily. Certainly also as a foreigner, working with children, I mean, that can be an enormous distraction. It can be enormous enhancement, but it can also be an enormous distraction as well. Sometimes children want to speak to you because you are the foreigner. Sometimes you're not able to speak to children because you are a foreigner, or actually children say certain things to you because you are a foreigner. So that can be an advantage or a disadvantage. In terms of thinking about communicating with children in humanitarian settings, well, any setting actually, I think it's also important to think about the audience as well. So who else is there with you, and how can you conduct conversations in private so that you can really get the views of someone. So if you don't speak their language, or if there's a disability and you need somebody to help you communicate with the child as a worker using an appropriate communication method, there will be issues there, for example, around the presence of a third party. You've got the other person there with you, translating or acting as a mediator in some way. Also, there would be issues, could be issues around people giving you the space to conduct a meeting with the child in private. That may be very difficult to do because of the logistics of where you are. In a refugee camp, there isn't a lot of privacy, so how are you going to have a private conversation? But also people's belief in, coming in and out of rooms if you're able to find them, or interrupting. And that also can really impinge upon a child's ability to speak, because they may feel reluctant to say certain things in front of other people. It may be that they suddenly swap to, different sort of cultural cues at that point because the other person is there. The other person might start interpreting for the child and telling you what it is that the child is saying, or what it is that they think the child is saying. And actually this is, I think, is a very difficult issue for anyone who works with children where you're using translation of any kind. It's really important to think about how you work with that translator and what you say to that translator beforehand, because sometimes what happens is people will tell you what they think the child is saying or what they think the child means, not necessarily saying what the child actually said.